This is a time of dis-ease. This is a time of disorientation. This is a time of disenchantment. This is a time of disequilibrium. It is also an epoch of nihilism. What is nihilism? What is nihilism? Let's talk about it. We know from Nietzsche and the withering, pulverizing critiques of philosophy that were launched by Nietzsche that there is nothing like pure knowledge. There is nothing like absolute knowledge. There is no such thing as the thing in itself. There is no difference between appearance and reality. There is no truth. There is no truth. There is an ever proliferative and ever proliferating multiplicity of truths, in quotation marks. But there is no supernatural guidance, no supernatural evaluation, no supernatural supervision. So where does consciousness of the absence of all of these ideals leave us? Well, it leaves us with nihilism. That's where we are now. Let's move back 2 steps. So similarly, the disintegration of Christianity leads to nihilism. So nihilism is a consequence of the disintegration of Christianity. Christianity dissolves whence value? Whence value? Where does it come from? Let's think about it. With Christianity, each human being has absolute value, right? Irrespective of the social situation in which one finds oneself. Irrespective of the social situation in which one finds oneself, one has absolute value, right? I can redeem myself. Now, Nietzsche's answer is much different than that. For Nietzsche, value resides in power, right? My value is my power. My value is self-potentiation, but I'm not going to get into that right now. In my next video on the will to power, I will discuss this at length, but not now. But in Christianity, the dependent and the dependently minded, those who are not self-sufficient, those who are not self-subsistent, would lose whatever consolation religion gave them and fall thence into nihilism. God dies. I talked about that in my last video. God dies. Not literally. God does not die literally. God does not die literally. But general belief in a God dies in the modern world. Thereupon, and thenceforward, nihilism. So nihilism is the consequence, the immediate consequence of the death of God. The collapse of idealism, we talked about this before. All of those ideals that I listed before, and more, and others. The collapse of idealism leads to nihilism. Disappointed idealists quickly become nihilists, right? Disappointed idealists become not just skeptics, but nihilists very, very quickly. Bars are populated by nihilists. As if alcohol would extinguish the still flickering embers within them. As if alcohol would extinguish the still flickering embers within them, within the nihilists who were once idealists. Utopianism leads to nihilism, right? Utopianism leads to nihilism. The failure of moral systems issues in disenchantment, and disenchantment issues in nihilism. The absence of a moral system leads to demystification, ennui. Now, where does this term come from? It wasn't invented by Nietzsche. Well, the term nihilism, or in German, Nihilismus, was coined by none other than the great philosopher and the very underestimated philosopher, Friedrich Jacobi. Jacobi is spelled Jacobi, Jacobi. Now, Jacobi was not a German idealist, although he lived among the German idealists. No, he was a critic of the German idealists. He was a critic of transcendental idealism of Kant. He was critical of the reflective idealism of Fichte. He hated them. He hated the German idealists. He hated Kantianism. Now, for Kant, we know, well, for Kant, we do not know things as they are, right? We only know things as they appear to our senses. According to Jacobi, however, things show themselves as they are. Jacobi believed in immediate existence. Immediate, that is to say, unmediated existence. Existence that is unmediated by reason. Jacobi was a critic of reason. Jacobi was a critic of rationality. Jacobi did not subscribe to universal concepts, and this was before Kierkegaard. Jacobi believed in the individual, not in the universal, not in universality. Jacobi criticized the universal ideas of rationality. Of course, that's a pleonasm because the ideas are universal. We already know that. But just to emphasize, the idolatry of reason, the idolatry of rationality leads to nihilism, according to Jacobi. Jacobi, again, believed in the individual. Jacobi believed in the exception, right? Jacobi accused those who held up the universal, such as Kant, as being nihilists or as paving the way for nihilism, because they believed in nothing. They believed in the air, right? They believed in, that is to say, gusty forms of thought. They believed in the airiness of ideals, the loftiness of ideals and of ideas. Jacobi did not. Jacobi believed in immediate existence and the individual. Anyway, what is nihilism according to Nietzsche? Well, let's talk about that for a while. So I'm going to quote from the 1885, 1886 notebooks. And I have two English translations here, and then I'll read the German. I'm just going to read Nietzsche's definition of nihilism. So if you're interested, this is the Stanford University Press translation of the 1885, 1886 notebooks. And this is the Stanford University Press translation of the late notebooks, but as you can tell, it's a very thin volume. Not all of the notebooks are translated, but the passages here as well. I'm going to be reading, this is from Cambridge University Press. I'm going to be reading from the Stanford University Press translation. So this is Nietzsche's definition of nihilism. The radical rejection of value, meaning desirability. The radical rejection of value, meaning desirability. Now I'm going to be reading from the German. Here it is. If you're interested, if you know German. There it is. You see that? Okay. So this is the passage, not a passage, it's just the definition in German. The definition of Nihilismus. Nihilismus, das heißt die radikale Ablehnung von Wert, Sinn, Wunschbarkeit. So there you got it. All right. To return to the lecture, nihilism takes different forms according to Nietzsche. And here I'm going to be paraphrasing from the 1885, 1886 notebooks. Nihilism might take the form of self-vivisection. Nietzsche writes quite a bit about this. Nihilism might take the form of self-vivisection, right? It might take the form of self-poisoning, self-envenoming. Here, Nietzsche probably is alluding to alcoholism. He probably means alcoholism, for which Nietzsche had no respect. Nietzsche had no respect for alcoholics. And I do think, I don't know if anyone has written about this, but I do think that there's an interesting correspondence in Nietzschean thought between alcoholism and nihilism. Anyway, along those lines, nihilism might take the form of intoxication. And this is a word that is often misused. I mean, what is intoxication? Intoxication means that you're putting toxins inside of yourself. I think Nietzsche is probably thinking of drug abuse. He does write about Rausch, which is a difficult word to translate. It might be translated as rapture, but this is not meant in the positive sense. Nihilism might take the form of romanticism, which for Nietzsche is a sign of the weakening of the will. Romanticism, and I've spoken about this in my lecture series on Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. But romanticism, according to Nietzsche, is symptomatic of volitional weakness, volitional enfeeblement, right? Nihilism might take the shape of misarchism, which is a really interesting word. Misarchism is the hatred of all inequalities, of all dissymmetries, of all hierarchies, of all rank, order, of all governmentality. That's misarchism, to be distinguished from anarchism. Really, misarchism is just hatred of authority in general, really. Hatred of law, of nomos in the Greek. But fundamentally, so nihilism is the impulse to destroy oneself. I mean, think about it. Nihilism is self-destructive. It's a self-destructive, self-defeating ideology, I would say. And I don't hesitate to call it an ideology. And I know there are those who don't think it is, but it is. It is. Nihilism is an ideology. But it's also fundamentally, again, the impulse to destroy oneself. The nihilistic will prefers the will to nothingness, to the absence of willing altogether, right? So the nihilistic will would rather will nothingness than not will at all. And so the nihilist prefers nothingness, prefers nullity, emptiness, absence, non-life, deathfulness. Moreover, nihilism is the malady of modernity, according to Nietzsche. So if you really want to know what Nietzsche thought of the modern world, he thought that the modern world is a nihilistic world. And as far as I can tell, we're still living through it. Even though, as I'm recording this video, it's 2021. No, this is an age of nihilism. This is not Nietzsche, but it's quite clear to me, and I'll have a few words to say about this later on, but this is an age of nihilism, a nihilistic epoch, to be sure. For all of the conventional ways of interpreting the world are falling apart, particularly Christianity. Now, I'm not talking about now. Christianity was invalidated a long time ago. This isn't to say that people aren't Christians, but the world isn't oriented around the crucifix, right? In Christianity, the crucifixion is the thesis, the axis, the axle around which the world is oriented, right? That's no longer the case. I've spoken to Christian theologians about this, and they agree with me. I'm not bashing Christianity. I'm just saying that the modern world is not the medieval period, right? No one believes in such ideologies anymore, or at least, even if they profess to believe and subscribe to these traditional ideologies, that is to say, religious, political, philosophical ideologies, they act as if they don't. I've spoken about this elsewhere. You could listen to my lecture series on Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. I talk quite a bit about that. I don't want to repeat myself here. So there is no good and there is no evil, but consciousness that good and evil do not exist, that neither good nor evil adheres to phenomena, that both good and evil are human-created schemata, labels, fabrications, fantastications, does not have to result in nihilism. And this is where Nietzsche gives us hope, whereas the nihilist gives despair to those who have no hope, right? That's a good way of putting it, I think. Nihilism gives despair, or let me put it this way. The nihilists give despair to those who have no hope. But this is not Nietzsche. Nietzsche does give hope. It is possible to invent new, life-affirming, healthy values, such as the value of selfishness, which I know sounds like a terrible thing to value, but a certain measure of selfishness is honest, because we are all selfish. Why not acknowledge that? Why not affirm who we really are? We would be happier as a result, Nietzsche is teaching us. Such as the joy of ruling, right? There's a pleasure that comes from ruling. Such as sensuousness and sensuality. The two words don't mean the same thing. Such as the love of deception, right? Which doesn't just mean lying, but the love of playing with appearances, the love of playing with illusions, the love of playing with disguises, of masks, with masks, excuse me. All of these are Nietzschean values. If you want to know what Nietzschean ethics is, look no further. And all of this is laid out, by the way, in Also sprach Zarathustra and elsewhere. But certainly it's laid out very clearly, I think, in Also sprach Zarathustra. There is indeed such a thing as Nietzschean ethics. I've said this before. It is just that Nietzschean ethics is not conventional ethics. So use the hammer as if one were a smithy and forge new values, according to Nietzsche. Once stellified ideals are de-idealized, and once diabolized values are now stellified, are angelized. We know what Nietzsche's values are. Nietzsche is not a nihilist. It's strange that I have to say this, but I've noticed over the years that people have mistyped Nietzsche as a nihilist. Again, Nietzsche is not a nihilist, right? So now that we are conscious that there is no supernatural force behind the world guiding our actions, this leads us into a state of nihilism. It's true, but nihilism is only a temporary state. It's only a transitional state. That's all it is. Life can become a form of lucid dreaming. I don't mean that literally, but I'm using this as a metaphor. So life can become a form of lucid dreaming if we recognize that causality does not exist. It's just a form of thought, right? If we recognize that we are inventors of our own reality, that something like an objective reality does not exist, if we recognize that we are not the causes of ourselves, if we recognize that we are not the causes of our thoughts, if we recognize that because we are not the causes of our thoughts, we are not the causes of our actions, right? There's no such thing as free will, right? If we recognize that our will is not the cause of what we do, at this point we become like lucid dreamers. So that's a simile I'm using. We know that we are dreaming while we're dreaming. I mean, that's possible. That's possible. I don't mean that lucid dreaming is possible. I mean that it's possible to live our lives with the consciousness that even though certain ideals might be necessary in order for the human species to evolve, that doesn't mean that they are true, right? Nihilism is the consciousness of the absence of limits. And it comes from recognition of the open scope of existence. Now, you might know the story of the old man in the mountain. The old man in the mountain said to Marco Polo, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." So pleasure Pleasure, though, is the stimulation that an obstacle brings, right? So is there any pleasure that comes from knowledge that nothing is true and everything is permitted? You know, this year I saw a film by Bob Fosse, who is a great director, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, even though he was a choreographer, I think primarily, but he gave us several. He didn't give us many, but he gave us several really interesting films. And one of them is Lenny, which is a fictionalized biography of Lenny Bruce. It probably has more to do with the filmmaker than Lenny Bruce. That came out around 1974, I believe. Anyway, Lenny Bruce knew, and when I say Lenny Bruce, I mean the Lenny Bruce in this film by Bob Fosse. Lenny Bruce knew that he could only enjoy himself by pitting himself against an obstacle, such as the law. You know, we see in scene after scene of this film, we see censors scribbling at their tables in the nightclub where Lenny Bruce is performing his stand-up routine. Although I don't consider Lenny Bruce to be a comedian. I even doubt whether or not he considered himself to be a comedian. He was more of a free speech advocate than anything. Anyway, so without the scribbling federal agents in the crowd transcribing his so-called obscenities, Lenny Bruce would never have enjoyed himself. This is suggested by the film in scene after scene of this film. Illimitable freedom of expression, illimitable freedom of anything, gives one no pleasure because you need an obstacle. Illimitable freedom is freedom to do whatever you please. But if you are free to do whatever you please, you're not pleased. That doesn't please you. Now, there's a phrase that Nietzsche borrows, he derives from Schopenhauer. You can find this all over Schopenhauer, and you can find this all over Nietzsche as well. Liberum arbitrium indifferentiae. This is a very, very difficult phrase to translate from the Latin, but I would translate it as the free choice of indifference. The free choice of indifference. It means the indetermination in which one outcome is equal to any other. Doesn't matter what you do, the outcome will be the same. So pleasure without boundaries or resistances is not pleasure. Such pleasure does not exist. Lenny Bruce, at least in Bob Fosse's figuration of Lenny Bruce, requires obstacles in order to experience his own pleasure, right? Nitimur invetitum. What is attractive is what is forbidden. What is appealing to us is what is forbidden. So anyway, but to get back to Nietzsche's social critique, with the ascension of democracy, right? The ascension of democracy, with the closure of the gap between me and you, between one person and another, the possibility of genius dries up, is exhausted, is no longer possible. Now, this is not me. This is not I should say. That's bad English. This is Nietzsche. This is Nietzsche's critique of democracy. I'm not a critic of democracy. I believe in democracy. Nietzsche did not. But nor did Nietzsche subscribe, to say it once more, to nihilism. He subscribed to free-spiritedness. Now, what is a free spirit? Well, a free spirit is a human being who hovers over every ideology, who levitates above every binary distinction, every either or, dichotomous, Manichaean distinction. Someone who wears a mask, someone who wears the mask of belief, but then quickly removes that mask and then puts on another mask that belongs to a different belief. That this is the free spirit, right? And the free spirit questions all traditional philosophical concepts, such as immediate certainty. How could there be immediate certainty, right? Doesn't certainty require some kind of mediation? Of course it does. Absolute knowledge. How could there be absolute knowledge? Knowledge is dependent. Knowledge is mediation. And what is absolute is absolved of all dependencies, of all relations, of all qualifications, of all exemptions, of all exceptions. So there can be no such thing as absolute knowledge. And truth. Well, I'm not going to talk about truth yet, but in another video in this series, which I have not yet recorded, I will talk about truth, according to Nietzsche. But anyway, to get back to the free spirit is an anti-ideologue. Or perhaps I should say, maybe not anti, but a non-ideologue. He or she is certainly an anti-dogmatist and never settles on any fixed position. Because as we know, dogmatism is inflexible, right? Dogmatism is static. Another way of saying this would be to say that the free spirit is forever in motion. The free spirit is forever in motion. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. You can do no better than listen to my 20-hour video series in which I recite my entire English translation of the book from beginning to end. And I comment upon the text from time to time. But if you listen to my audiobook rendition of my translation of Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, you might remember the plant metaphor that Nietzsche uses, the sipo matador, the matador fig. I want to explain what a sipo matador is. Well, it's a parasitical fig, right? The matador fig. And like all parasites, it destroys the host. Now, this is also the case for the free spirit. You could also translate the free spirit, and I know that, and Nietzsche knew this, that the term free spirit has been abused. Even in his own time, it was abused in England. And today, it's abused all the time. I'm a free spirit. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm a free spirit. Well, that's not exactly what Nietzsche meant. Nietzsche was far more radical than that. But anyway, some of the terms that I use would be antinomist, or I should pronounce it this way, and antinomist, right? Antinomist, anti, we all know what that means. Nomos means law, order, I've said that before. A libertist, not a libertarian, not a liberal, but a libertist, someone who is destructive or who at least is surpassing of all tradition, of all convention. But let's think about the matador fig for just a moment, because I want you to understand Nietzsche's metaphor. The free spirit is the matador fig. The free spirit is the sipo matador. What does this mean? Well, the sipo matador destroys the host tree as it ascends to the summit of the tree, and there displays its fullest happiness as it unveils, as it reveals its corolla, right? So if you think about it, the free spirit is parasitical of tradition. And what this means, of course, is that the free spirit requires tradition as its host, which it then destroys. The matador fig entangles the host tree as it rises. The matador fig, the sipo matador, is an avatar of the free spirit, a plant that wraps itself around a tree and then strangles the tree to death. At the end of its journey, the fig exposes the corolla of its flower in the sun. So let's talk about nihilism and why it's such a problem. Well, nihilism is arrogance. Now you might say, well, who is more arrogant than Nietzsche? Well, perhaps the only person who is more arrogant than Nietzsche would be a nihilist, who, again, just to be clear, is a former idealist. What arrogance to assume that the world is meaningless simply because the dominant way of interpreting the world is false. A nihilist is someone who thinks, well, the Christian interpretation of the world doesn't make sense, so nothing is true and everything is permitted. Bosh. Total bosh. Total nonsense. This is arrogance and extremism. Simply because one interpretation of the world, even if it's the authoritative, official interpretation of the world, is not meaningful, this does not mean that life is meaningless. Simply because one interpretation of the world is not meaningful, this does not imply that life is meaningless. The nihilist boomerangs from God is truth and life is holy to life has no meaning. You see what happens here? But life does have meaning. It has meaning for us. I've spoken about this in another video, a video about the meaning of life, which goes beyond Nietzsche. I invite you to watch that video and listen to it. So again, for Nietzsche, the dichotomy between appearance and reality has been dissolved, right? The world of appearances is the only world there is. And consciousness that there is no purpose, there is no totality, and there is no truth does indeed lead to nihilism at first. But then one may move beyond nihilism into free-spiritedness and to over-humanity, right? The final stage of humanity is over-humanity, which I'm not going to get into now. There are too many reasons for happiness for anyone to become disaffected, but one must first become conscious of these reasons. Consciousness of the ineluctability of meaning would prevent any thinking person from becoming a nihilist. The point is to find one's own purpose in living. What am I saying? Meaning is ineluctable. Meaning is inexorable. Life is meaningful whether you want it to be or not. But the point, again, is to find one's own point in living. Now, nihilism, and I've spoken with a friend of mine about this, someone I truly respect and admire about this, but nihilism is dangerous. And we need to talk about why that is. Nihilism is extremely dangerous. And Nietzsche knew this. Now, this is from Notebook 11, which was composed between November 1887 and March 1888. This passage is extraordinary. Listen, the rise of nihilism. Nihilism is not just a contemplation of the in vain, and not just the belief that everything deserves to perish. One puts one's hand to it. One makes it perish. That is perhaps illogical. But the nihilist doesn't believe in the compulsion to be logical. Nihilism is the state of strong spirits and wills. And for these, it's not possible to stop at the no of judgment. The no of the deed springs from their nature. Annihilation by the judgment is seconded by annihilation by the hand. So we're not just talking about, the annihilation of concepts, the annihilation of ideals, the annihilation of ideologies. We're also talking about violence. And when I say violence, I mean violence, physical destruction. I mean carnage. That's not what I mean. It's what he means. Now, let me read this passage in the German. I actually don't own the German text, I'm sorry to say, so I had to find it on the Nietzsche channel website. But I do have it here, so let me read this in the German. Die Heraufkunft des Nihilismus. Der Nihilism, he doesn't use the original term, it's strange. Der Nihilism ist nicht nur eine Betragsamkeit über das Umsonst und nicht nur der Glaube, dass alles wert ist, zugrunde zu gehen. Man legt Hand an, man richtet zugrunde. Das ist, wenn man will, unlogisch, aber der Nihilist glaubt nicht an die Nötigung, logisch zu sein. Es ist der Zustand starker Geister und Willen, und solchen ist es nicht möglich, bei dem Nein des Urteils stehen zu bleiben. Das Nein der Tat kommt aus ihrer Natur, der Vernichtung. Okay, it's divided. It's hyphenated. Der Vernichtung. Durch das Urteil sekundiert die Vernichtung durch die Hand. So there it is. Nihilism leads to violence. A meaningless life leads to violence. You need a creative project. Human beings are logogenetic, to coin a term. As far as I know, I'm the first person to use this term, although I haven't done a Google search on it. But human beings are logogenetic, which is to say, they are productive of the logos. You need the logos. Remember what Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Just to paraphrase, someone who has a why can endure any how, Nietzsche tells us, right? He means that a logos makes any hardship endurable and worth struggling through. My name is Joseph Suglia, Suglia, and this concludes my lecture on nihilism. I hope that you benefited from it. And if you were a nihilist at the beginning of this video, I hope that you are no longer a nihilist. I hope that you are a nihilist no longer, and perhaps you are a free spirit, I don't know. But my name is Joseph Suglia. My surname is spelled Suglia. I have 2 more videos in this series, 2 more videos that are coming. The next video will be about the will to power, which is often misunderstood. And lastly, I will address the question, what is truth? Thank you, everyone. This is Joseph Suglia signing out and signing off. Thank you.